This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
Pretty much a joint cooperative effort in writing articles. Sometimes I would have an idea and would sketch something out. Other times Marian would have an idea.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Allan Moose was co-author of the book Atari Assembly Language Programmer's Guide, which was published by Weber Systems in 1986. He wrote the book with his wife and writing partner Marian Lorenz. She passed away in 1992. The two also wrote many articles for Antic and A.N.A.L.O.G computing magazines. Their articles included many about displayless interrupts and vertical blank interrupts and pretty mathematical graphics routines. This interview took place on May 12, 2018.
I should say that I'm in my late 70s, so teenagehood is 1950s, and I grew up in a household in which science was an ever-present thing. My father was a high school biology teacher in the high school that I went to, and more than that, he was a naturalist. So we did a lot of things such as collecting wildflowers, doing photography, nature photography, and so on. So I probably when I was 14 or 15, subscribed to Scientific American and ground a 6-inch telescope mirror. And somewhere in that, possibly in Scientific American, possibly a catalog from Edmund Scientific, I got this little device that was a mechanical computer, and as I recall, it basically added binary digits. And that was my first exposure to something that would compute. I wasn't terribly impressed with it because I didn't know what binary was useful for. But I do remember lusting over ads in the back of Scientific American for the either the Brainiac or the what was the other one? Well, it doesn't matter. The Brainiac computer, which was a kind of analog device. Mm-hmm. But I didn't buy one. Not quite sure why, but I never did. And I ended up somewhere in high school deciding that I wanted to be a physicist. I read George Gamow's Creation of the Universe book and a biography of Einstein, and I wanted to do something that the rest of the family wasn't doing because they were all interested in biology. And so that was present throughout my life. So I won't go through all of the details, but I ended up in the summer of 1958 in the little town of Geneseo in New York, where there was a state teachers college. And my father had passed away my senior year of high school, and my mother sold the farm that we had at that time and enrolled in college so that she could get a degree in education. And I met Marian in the summer of 1958. She was attending summer school that year. And we had a rather rapid courtship and got married in December of 1958. Mm-hmm. So that answers your first question.
Mm-hmm.
What role did she play in this? Now, I should point out that Marian had polio when she was 13, going on 14, and her health was never robust. She had two of the forms of polio, one called bulbar that attacks the respiratory system, and the other is spinal, which attacks the leg nerves, arm nerves, motor neurons.
Mm-hmm.
So she always had health issues, and Marian passed away in spring of 1992. Marian and I went to college together at the State Teachers College, as it was then known. Incidentally, my father had attended there in the 1920s. Marian finished first, and we moved to Long Island, New York. I don't know what you know about the geography of New York State, but Long Island is a big sandbar, about 15 miles wide and 125 miles long, that extends out into the Atlantic Ocean. At that time, the population was rapidly growing, and the school districts needed special education teachers, and that was Marian's major, was special ed.
Mm-hmm.
So we moved there, and the intention was that I would go to Adelphi University and complete a degree, and I chose mathematics because I could finish the quickest there rather than physics. So I completed my degree after taking a couple years off to work. Completed my degree in September of 1964. Okay, now in 1964, there was New York World's Fair that was located in Flushing Meadows.
Mm-hmm.
And Flushing Meadows is near Queens. It's the site of the Belmont Racetrack, which you may have heard of because of the big race there every spring.
Sure.
And there was one pavilion there that was a favorite that I went to several times, probably 4 or 5, and that was IBM's display. And they had, I remember this wall diorama of history of mathematics and computing, and a movie program. I don't remember the contents, but I remember being somewhat interested in the computers as something that one might, look into. So I couldn't get a job in math after I graduated. Part of the thing was Long Island at that time was the location of a lot of defense industries, but defense industries were not really stable because they depended on government contracts, and people would get hired and work for 4 or 5 years and then get laid off, and I hit it at the wrong time. So Marian suggested to me that, well, you should apply to be a substitute teacher in special ed. I did that and substituted for a week and got hired after a week of that permanently. So I taught special ed for 14 years, during which time I was able to get a master's degree at Adelphi University in the evenings, and then go on and get my PhD in physics. See, Adelphi was set up so they could serve the people in the defense industry, the engineers and so on, and they held their graduate level classes in the evenings. So that worked fine for me. And one of the requirements for my degree was to demonstrate facility in programming. The deal was, prior to the early 70s, the general requirement for a PhD was to show writing capability, reading and writing capability in 2 foreign languages, preferably German and French, because at that time German was the de facto scientific language. But they were moving away from that, and so Adelphi's physics department switched it to 1 foreign language and computer programming. So I included in my thesis a program written in Fortran. So that was my first big introduction to computers. Mm-hmm. I wasn't terribly impressed with Fortran at that time, and I note that for something I'll say a little bit later. I got my PhD in 1975, and I applied to a number of different colleges and didn't get any jobs there, but I did get get to teach a course as a adjunct at a small college, and then a college named Southampton College had an opening in fall of 1978, and I started teaching there. Now, Southampton's out on the east end of Long Island, out where it's a big resort area, and mostly it's filled up with very large houses that are owned by wealthy people in New York City. But the Southampton College was a branch of Long Island University, and it was located very close to the ocean, and its main focus was on marine science. And for roughly 45 years, it was probably the premier college to get marine science at. Now, in the time, roughly in the late 70s, was, as you probably know, the start of a lot of interest in small computers, mm-hmm. such as the Kim one comes to mind. And I started reading magazines, I believe, things like Creative Computing and Compute. I know that when I was hired at Southampton, the Natural Science Division had just purchased a Commodore PET. I assume
Certainly.
They were, yep.
Yeah.
And I didn't really do much with it except, look at it and play around a little bit. And then there was they purchased an Apple II, and I played with that a little bit. I got the impression very early that with an Apple, you were pretty much constrained to do with the computer what the Apple Corporation felt you should be doing. And that was a little different from my impression in my readings about the Atari, because I was trying to figure out what magazines I read most, and I think they were Compute and Creative Computing at that time. And that time is roughly 1978, 1979, 1980. And I had the impression that the Atari people were much more forthright in telling about the design of their computer and the inner workings of it. That's important because somewhere around 1980 or 81, I left I was back talking to Marian. Did I mention we got divorced in 1976?
No, you did not?
I did not. Yeah. Well, it was basically an amicable divorce. And somewhere around 1980 or 81, I left a TI-99 with Marian for a couple weeks, and there must have been some programming cartridges or something with it, possibly games, and she got very interested in it, and she asked me, well, what computer should I get? Now, the TI-99 I didn't care for it because the price was very cheap, but peripherals and programs were very expensive. But I had read enough about the Atari and the fact that they said it seemed like they told people a lot about how the innards of the machine worked, that I suggested she buy an Atari, which she did. And I didn't, at that time, hadn't purchased one because my pay at Southampton was not particularly good. So I couldn't afford it. And but I did stop by on weekends at Marian's house and experiment with the Atari. And at some point there in the early 80s, we talked about writing an article or two and submitting them to the magazines, such as Antic, which I think was the first one. And that's pretty much where it started. We might have talked about, I might have talked about writing a book. Now, one of the, and this all evolved into writing things in machine language. I'm not quite sure why. It might have been my interest that I thought it was a useful thing to do. But that's what we started with. was machine language. Now, the interesting thing was that once I started digging into the machine language, things about programming kind of clicked. It was either the nature of the machine language as opposed to a set of commands that somebody else dreamt up. But after I had sketched out on paper, or actually written out in an organized way on paper, what it was I wanted to do, it became a very natural thing. I know you had asked, where did I learn assembly language programming? Here and there. I think that both Compute and Creative Computing and Magazine Micro would have examples of assembly language programming. I did buy a book on 6502 assembly language. Unfortunately, I left it at the other house, so I can't tell if it had any great features. But through reading De Re Atari and figuring out what they were talking about and the other technical manuals from Atari, and Marian or I ended up buying a lot of those. I have all of the technical manuals at the other house. I managed to teach myself and then teach Marian about it. So what it all evolved to was a pretty much a joint cooperative effort in writing articles. Sometimes I would have an idea and would sketch something out. Other times Marian would have an idea and she would sketch it out, and she would she might not go into the details of the assembly language in her sketches, but would have some ideas for an article. For example, there were a couple on writing educational software. We moved into graphics type of programs. Marian, I think, subscribed to Scientific American, and she liked the mathematical games part. And there were a couple of ideas there, if I recall, that were based on Martin Gardner's work. Let's see. I think I've run out of a lot of my prepared stuff. We're into the 1980s, and there was one kind of amusing thing. At least it's amusing to me. I would come, I would be teaching at Southampton, during the week, and I would drive to Marian's, which is just a matter of 25, 30 miles, on a Saturday morning to talk with her about a project, and often I would have left something I had written with her to look at, and each time I would come, the first 5 minutes of my visit, she would tell me just what a piece of garbage garbage I had written, and how nobody could possibly understand it, and how could I be so stupid? And after the 5 minutes was over, she was ready to work, and I used to get a kick out of that because I'm not sure that she was all that serious. She might have been venting a little bit. So I found that kind of funny. Okay, so maybe you should ask some questions if you have any.
Sure, I do. First of all, regarding the quality of the writing, I don't know if it was you or her, but I read and skimmed your book, Atari Assembly Language Programmer's Guide, and it is one of the most readable assembly language books that I have seen. Many of them were written by programmers for programmers and are not very clear, and yours was really bucked the trend, and well done on that.
Well, thank you. I can explain something about that, and it comes from being teachers. Now, two things. Marian and I both taught special ed, and though we both taught the youngest classes of children who at that time were called trainably retarded, they had IQs, actually that was mine, had IQs below 50. Marian's had IQs from 50 to 75. You get used to breaking things down into chunks of information. And with the kids I taught, we're talking about very elementary chunks of information. And when I say information, I'm using it in a very general sense, such as this is blue and this is red, or put the piece of paper. I used to make hand puppets with kids. A hand puppet with the face of an owl, for example, and you break it down into the where you put the pre-cut papers are and following instructions, because these kids eventually would be in sheltered workshops. Then I moved into teaching calculus and calculus-based physics to marine science majors, say marine biologists who had very little interest in learning either calculus or calculus-based physics. So you learn how to explain things is basically it. And you know what your objective is, where your target audience, what their background is, and you try to present things so it's reasonably obvious what it is you're doing. So if there's anything to the writing that is useful, that was always in the background. Now, I'm trying to think, because I saw something among the papers where I had deliberately phrased stuff, but it's in the phrasing of having your goal of teaching in mind, and that's basically the mindset. Now, I did find, and I just discovered it this morning, that I had it in a folder. It's actually an envelope. The editor's copy notes on the very first Antic article that Marian and I sent to them, that they published playlists simplified.
Mm-hmm.
And I was amazed at the amount of wording changes and so on that the editor made. And my reaction was, gee, was it that bad? And who knows, it could have been, because it was the first effort.
Well, that's super interesting. I would love to see that, just kind of see what the process was.
Okay, I can. I've got a copying machine, and I'll copy it for you.
Thank you. So I'm curious how you found this publishing company. So I know very little about Weber Publishing. It seems like they didn't really publish that many books. The ones that they did publish must not have had very wide distribution, because they're very hard to find now. So can you tell me what you can about this company and how you found them and how it sold?
Okay. After we finished our book, I think we sent out 8 or 10, packages of our writings and of the writing and our vita of what we did and so on. And Weber Systems had a book that I think Mr. Weber had written about the Atari that had been a pretty good seller. And that was just seeing that book in the local bookstore, his book, was the reason that we said, let's send our prospectus to Weber Systems. And he was the only one that was interested. And I later figured, well, he must have had success with his own book, and he decided to become a publisher. And I wasn't aware that he had published other books. You obviously have. And I can't tell you anything other than that maybe he self-published his first book. Because Marian did all of the correspondence with the magazines and with the potential book publishers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't really know beyond what I've told you.
Okay. Did you make any money off this book? Did it sell very well?
Well, we got an advance of $2,500,
mm-hmm.
and which we split, and that was it. So I don't know that it sold very well. The local bookstore got 2 copies of. I bought both. So I didn't make any money there.
Mm-hmm.
I apparently gave one away somewhere. I don't remember when or to whom. And you'll get the second one. And and Weber Publishing sent 2 copies, one for each of us. And that's the extent of my knowledge.
Wow.
I mean, he was in Cleveland. I think that's the address in the front of the book. Now, we're talking about the book. That reminds me of one thing. There's one big flaw with the book. It's kind of interesting because it's an example of how when you're writing something or programming something, you'll get so in the habit of doing particular things that you don't think about the person who's on the other end and doesn't know what it is you did. And our programs, our assembly language programs in the book, were essentially, they're demonstrations of how you can do something. And not provide any way to, in essence, regain control of the computer once the program has run. It would, and what we were in the habit of doing was just pushing the reset button, which would then exit that particular segment of the overall program. It would exit the assembly language part and return control back to the basic. And so if you are inclined to type in any of the programs, like there's a yellow submarine program, once it's done its thing, you need to push reset to exit and go back to the regular starting screen.
I think that was pretty typical for assembly language programs, actually. There was usually no elegant way to get out of them.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
The only reason I found out about that was that somebody who had bought the book, so it did sell one copy, wrote a letter to the publisher, which they forwarded it to us, complaining that our programs hung the machine up.
You sell one copy and he writes in to complain about it.
Yeah, well, what can I tell you? There's cranky people all over the world.
Yeah, that's true. It's always been true. You also wrote for Analog Computing and for Antic magazine a lot of articles about vertical blank interrupts and some mathy stuff, like doing tessellations and drawing roses and things like that.
Yes. Let me just get my list here of what we wrote. But yeah, we wrote for Antic, Analog Computing. We had one article in Micro on writing educational software, and Atari Explorer. I had an article with Richard Kaiser, who was a former student, and Marian and I wrote an article titled Hacking the 8-Bit Atari, and that was published, I think, in 1988 or so, back when the ST was coming out, and this was kind of a look back, I guess.
Where was that published?
Atari Explorer.
Oh, okay, sure.
Let's see. I will tell you. I have the copy here, one of the few. Published in 1989, November, December, of Atari Explorer. Okay, so that was our last article on the 8-bit Atari. Things changed roughly in 1990. I think my mother passed away in 90 or 91. Actually, 1991. And Marian passed away in 92. Marian and I had started working on more graphics-oriented programs. The 1980s was the heyday of chaos and fractals.
Sure.
With nonlinear differential equations, because you could examine them with numerical programs, and you got Mandelbrot and his set, and we got interested in doing that sort of thing and working out ideas for a book on computer graphics. But that never, that ended. Let's see, in the late 80s, Marian bought a IBM PC knockoff, Gateway 2000, I think, and I bought pieces of hardware and assembled one, and so we were into doing that. And Marian bought a couple of books on nonlinear dynamics. Now, I have to tell you, one of the interesting things, when we were in college together at the end of the 1950s and 1960s, Marian had to take a math course in college, and it just did not make any sense to her. She'd had a terrible struggle and managed to get through with a D. So you come to the 1980s, and she gets involved, interested in using her computer and writing these articles and doing the math-oriented graphics, and starts reading about fractals and certain nonlinear dynamics stuff. Sometime, it was probably 1991, so 33 years later after the math experience, she opens up her math book, and one day when she's at the kitchen and points to it and says, "The thing that scares me is I understand this stuff." And the point is that when you have a motivation to do something with computing, you can find ways of understanding things that makes a lot more sense sometimes than the way it's taught in a traditional mathematics course. And so, do you have more questions?
I'd like to jump ahead, and if you could tell me a little bit about what you do today.
Okay. Well, let's see. Where do I start? I have not stopped doing what I've done most of my life, which is reading physics and fooling around with computers. Right. I've put a lot of stuff off until someday, and I've reached the point where someday has arrived. I'm also able to buy many more books than I need.
That's great, isn't it?
Yes, it is great. My major interests in physics have been general relativity and quantum mechanics. Those are basically the two big deals. My physics thesis title wouldn't be terribly illuminating, but it was based on essentially the wormhole idea, the connection between this universe and another one, which of course is at the background of the movie Interstellar. That idea originally came up with a chap named Einstein, with he and a co-worker named Nathan Rosen wanted to model an elementary particle as a singularity in our space-time, in a sense, or actually a wormhole in our space and time, a wormhole between this space-time and another one, or a jump off point from one part of our space and time to another. And the problem with that is that it doesn't stay open. Now, a chap named Ellis wrote a beautiful little paper on this wormhole idea in the 1970s, and he had to modify Einstein's equation slightly to get it to stay open. And my thesis was to do the same things Einstein did, but to do it in 5 dimensions. Why 5? Because you could introduce a scalar field, think of another source of energy, that would keep the wormhole open. And so that was my thesis. And it became a popular topic in the late 1980s when a chap named Kip Thorne and a student wrote a paper on it as an educational topic. And you may have heard Kip Thorne won the Nobel Prize this last year for his work on gravitational waves. So I read a paper a few months ago about wormholes and said, maybe I'll go back and look at all that stuff I did a long time ago and see what's been done by others and see what's a good idea. If there are any good ideas that I get that I could, write something up on. So that's one of the things I'm doing. I suspect there's a connection between quantum physics and this topic the topic of wormholes. This is not original with me. Others have thought the same thing, but they haven't done much with it the way I think they could. So I was going to look into that. They're connected. But as much as that, actually maybe a little bit more. General relativity is traditionally has been a very algebraic intensive field. The equations can be sometimes a page and a half. That's 8.5 by 11 page long. And I've always hated algebra. But the only reason I did it was that I'm cussed. It was the hardest thing I could figure out to do. There's been programs written, they started writing them in the 1980s that actually do mathematics, do the symbol manipulation. What's your background? What mathematics do you know?
I got like D's in algebra in high school, and
okay, stop there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there's these operations called differentiation and integration that form the basis of calculus, and there's rules on how you use them and so on. Differentiation is a scheme that tells you how things change in space or time, or how they change. And integration is an interesting operation. It's the reverse of differentiation, but it's got uses, and I guess one of the uses that I can just use as an example is how do you find the volume of something? With integration, what you do is you take that volume and you cut it up into little pieces and you add up the pieces. Cut it up into simpler pieces and add up the pieces. Mm-hmm. But all of this stuff can just generate lots of algebraic terms and junk that you got to simplify. Well, it's quite successfully people have devised computer programs that manipulate those symbols and save you a lot of work. And the latest thing I'm doing with that is I'm trying to learn how to use a program called Mathematica, which can take the equations of general relativity and do all of that manipulation that would take me 3 or 4 days to do, because I would have to go through it once and then go through it a second time to get all the mistakes. The first time I go through it to see how it's done. The second time I go through it to correct all the mistakes that I made the first time. And the third time I go through it to make sure that what I did the second time was correct. Well, if I get good with this program Mathematica, it will do that for me. But more than that, in my now that I've reached advanced middle age, it has struck me that I'm more of a visual thinker than an algebraic thinker. Mathematica has beautiful graphics capabilities. And so I want to get very familiar with those, because I think that it would be very interesting to look at some of the results that you can get from the equations of general relativity visually, to look at the make visual pictures of them, of sections of different space-times. So that's one thing I'm entertaining myself with. The other thing is I've done for the last God knows how many years. I started in 1992 fooling around with artificial neural networks. And I've been using BASIC for all these years. Well, there's this nice language that you probably have heard of, Python.
Sure. With
lots of libraries that people have put together. And, of course, Google company has devised this TensorFlow, and so on. And so I decided that I would learn Python, again, for the visualization. In fact, I've got a book coming, I think it's supposed to come tomorrow, from Amazon on visualization with Python. So that's how I entertain myself.
Very nice. Cool.
Well, actually, I should say that's part of how I entertain myself. I also like to do woodworking, and I find that I can't just sit and think all day like I used to. I have to get up and do something physical. So there's various woodworking projects that I do. I've got to make a couple of clocks for my daughter, and I've been working on the tube for a telescope, a 12.5-inch telescope for an observatory that is nearby. It's a truss tube telescope, and there's parts of it that have to be made of wood. Again, have you ever heard of Dobsonian telescopes?
No.
You're not into that? Okay. Well, it's a relatively simple design of a mount for the parts of the telescope that do the stuff, the mirror and the eyepiece, the focusing stuff, and its mount is made of wood. The part that holds the mirror is made of wood, and I decided to make it the tube octagonal, just because it would look better. But that's been a bit of a project which got slowed down because one of the pieces of wood that I cut got caught by the blade and came back and hit my left hand. And 9 stitches later, I had to quit working for a couple weeks.
Didn't you tell me that one of your first projects was grinding a lens for a telescope? I
did.
Guess it all comes back around again.
Yeah, it does. But so that's how as I said, that's how I entertain myself.
Nice. All right.
Any more questions?
If you could send a message to the people who still enjoy using Atari computers, they're listening to this podcast, if you could send them a message, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
What I would tell them more than anything is never stop learning new things. That just because you've retired doesn't mean that you can't do stuff. One of the things that I have found out is that I understand mathematics and physics far better now than I did when I was in my 20s and 30s. And even if I go back to read books that I read then, I find new things because the amount of knowledge that I have is greater than when I was younger. And I think that's the biggest thing that I could say, because I think people reach a point when they're in their 70s that they may downgrade what their abilities are. And I think that's the best thing I could say to people.
All right.
And if I were to say something to younger people, I would say if you don't understand it the first time, don't worry about it, because confusion is the first step in learning. And things that are confusing can be inherently frustrating, but the subconscious will process a lot of information, so that if you're confused the first time you read it, wait a few days or a week and go back and try it again.
Oh, I love that. I wrote that down. I've written that down on my paper here. I love that. Confusion is the first step to learning. Thank you so much, Allan.
Okay. Good talking to you.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, there are 2 ways you can help. You can help fund these interviews directly by contributing to my Patreon. A small monthly contribution will help offset the expenses of making these oral history interviews. Contribute at patreon.com/Savitz. Or make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.